I was 17 when the Black Ship came for us. They say every world in the Imperium receives the visitation once per century, like clockwork, like the turning of some vast and indifferent cosmic machine. For 99 years, you can almost forget. You can pretend the Tithe doesn't exist, that the Adeptus Astra telepathica is just another distant bureaucracy, another layer of imperial administration that has nothing to do with your daily struggle for survival in the Hive. But in that 100th year, when the Voxcasters crackled to life with the governor's proclamation, when you see your neighbors lock their doors and shutter their windows, when the Arbites begin their roundups in earnest, that's when you remember. That's when every family with a secret they've been hiding, every parent who's noticed their child's strange dreams, every sibling who's seen their brother make objects move with his mind, feels their blood turn to ice. The ship arrived on the 3rd day of the proclamation period. I was in the upper levels of Hive Tertius, in our HAB unit overlooking the industrial sectors, when my mother grabbed my arm with a grip that left bruises. Through the viewport, against the amber haze of our world's polluted sky, we watched it descend. Not like the bulk transporters that brought supplies from the orbital stations, not like the glorious Navy vessels that occasionally graced us with their presence, their hulls emblazoned with Imperial Aquilas and ablaze with running lights. This ship came in silence. Its hull was black, not the black of paint or simple darkness, but a black that seemed to devour light itself, an ancient ebony metal covered in ward symbols and hex signs that hurt to look at directly. No lights, no fanfare, no glory, just a blunt utilitarian mass that settled into orbit like a carrion bird perching on a corpse. My mother's hands were shaking. "Kael," she whispered, and I knew. I had known for months, really, since the first time I'd heard her thoughts as clearly as if she'd spoken them aloud, since the day I'd felt the janitor's rage from 3 floors away and known that he was about to strike his apprentice. Since I'd touched my father's hand and felt the cancer eating through his lungs 6 months before any medici would diagnose it. I was a psyker. I was a witch. I was cursed. "We could run," my father said, but his voice held no conviction. Where would we run? The planetary defense forces would be on high alert. The Arbites had their lists. They always had their lists, compiled over the past century from reports, from suspicious neighbors, from medici anomalies and patterns of coincidence that followed certain bloodlines. And even if we somehow escaped the world, where would we go? The Imperium stretched across 1,000,000 worlds. There was nowhere to hide from the Emperor's reach. The Arbites came at dawn on the 7th day. I didn't resist. I'd seen what happened to those who resisted, had heard the stories whispered in the lower Hive markets. The Arbites don't take chances with Psykers. They can't afford to. One moment of true fear, one instant of psychic panic, and a witch could tear minds apart, could open a crack in reality itself and let the horrors of the warp come spilling through. So they came in force. 8 enforcers in full carapace armor, shock mauls charged and ready, led by a proctor whose eyes were hidden behind a blast visor. They bound my hands with sanctified chains that made my skin burn where they touched, fitted a psychic dampener around my neck that felt like ice and lead and drowning all at once. My mother wept. My father stood rigid, one hand on her shoulder, his face a mask of the stoic resignation that was the only acceptable imperial response to fate. He'd served in the Astra Militarum in his youth, had learned that you don't question, you endure. As they led me away, I heard my mother's final words, "May the Emperor protect you." But I also heard her thoughts, the ones she would never, could never speak aloud. "Thank the throne it's over. Thank the throne the curse is leaving our home." That was when I truly understood. I wasn't just leaving, I was being excised, cut out like a tumor. My family would mourn, yes, but they would also feel relief. The Sanctum Psykana was a fortress built into the Hive's foundation, all reinforced rockcrete and psi-shielded walls that seemed to press down on my consciousness like a physical weight. The dampener helped, actually. Without it, I think the psychic pressure of being in a building with hundreds of other terrified witches would have driven me mad in minutes. As it was, I could only feel them as a distant roar, like standing next to a massive turbine, a constant thrumming presence that never quite resolved into individual voices, but never quite faded into silence either. They processed us like cargo. Name, age, home district, nature of manifestation. A clerk with augmetic eyes recorded everything on a data slate, his movements efficient and bored. How many times had he done this? How many times would he do it again before his service ended? Behind him, through a reinforced viewport, I could see the holding pens. Hundreds of souls, maybe thousands, packed into chambers lit by harsh lumens, guarded by armed soldiers with their lasguns held ready. Men, women and children, young and old, the sick and the sound. I saw an elderly man, his hair white and his hands gnarled with age, weeping silently as he stood against a wall. I saw a girl who couldn't have been more than 9, clutching a torn, stuffed animal, her eyes wide with incomprehension. I saw a woman in the robes of a mid-hive administrator, her face set in furious denial, as if she could simply refuse this reality through force of will alone. I saw a boy my own age, handsome despite his terror, who caught my eye for just a moment. In that glance I felt a strange kinship. We were the same, he and I. Cursed, condemned, cargo. They kept us in the sanctum for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of processed food that tasted like cardboard and despair, of sleeping on metal shelves in rooms so crowded you couldn't lie down without touching another body, of standing in lines for the sanitation facilities while armed guards watched impassively, of the constant psychic weight of hundreds of terrified minds pressed together like rats in a trap. The dampeners helped, but they couldn't eliminate it entirely. Every night, I dreamed of drowning in a sea of fear. Some tried to escape. On the 8th day, a middle-aged man, I never learned his name, somehow got his dampener off and made a run for the outer doors, using his powers to fling guards aside like dolls. They put him down with massed lasgun fire in under 30 seconds, and the smell of burned meat filled the corridors for hours afterward. They left his body where it fell for 2 days, a reminder, a warning. The message was clear. This is mercy compared to what awaits you if you become a threat. On the 15th day, a girl went mad. She simply started screaming, screaming and screaming, and even through the dampener I could feel the psychic shriek of her breaking mind, could feel the moment when something in her consciousness shattered like glass. They came with sedatives and restraints, dragged her off to some isolated cell. I never saw her again. Later I heard whispers that she'd been executed immediately, that they couldn't risk transporting someone who'd already broken. A mercy killing, some said, better than what awaited her on Terra. On the 19th day, an adept of the Adeptus Astra telepathica came to address us. He was an old man, his face lined with more than age, his eyes holding a weariness that seemed to go down to his soul. He wore robes of midnight blue, marked with the symbols of his order, and when he spoke, his voice carried the tone of someone who'd delivered this speech 1,000 times before and would deliver it 1,000 times again. "You are the Emperor's tithe," he said. "You are Psykers, witches, cursed with the touch of the warp. Left untrained, unsanctioned, you are more dangerous than any Xenos, more deadly than any weapon ever devised by man. A single uncontrolled Psyker can doom a world. A single moment of weakness can tear a hole in reality and let the ruinous powers flood through. You know this. Your families know this. The Imperium knows this." He paused, letting his words sink in, letting us feel the weight of our own nature. "But you also have value. Properly trained, properly sanctioned, Psykers are the Imperium's greatest resource. You enable communication across the stars. You see the threats that lurk beyond mortal sight. You serve the Emperor in ways no ordinary human ever could. Some of you, the strongest, the most stable, the most blessed, will be given this opportunity. You will be trained at the Scholastica Psykana on Holy Terra itself. You will undergo the soul binding, and you will serve. Another pause. Longer this time, heavy with unspoken truth. Some of you will not survive the journey. The weak in mind or body will falter. This is inevitable. This is necessary. And some of you, upon reaching Terra, will be found unsuitable for training. But even then, even in this, you will serve. The Emperor requires sustenance to maintain the Astronomican, the great beacon that guides ships through the warp. He sits upon the golden throne, undying, eternal, and he hungers. Those who cannot serve as Sanctioned Psykers will serve in this most holy of ways. Your souls will fuel the light that keeps humanity from extinction. There can be no greater honor. There can be no higher purpose. The room was silent except for the sound of suppressed weeping. In 3 days, the shuttles will take you to the Black Ship, the Adept continued. Pray to the Emperor for strength. Pray for acceptance. Pray that you are found worthy, and know that however this ends, you are serving humanity's survival. The individual is nothing. The species is everything. In the Emperor's name. In the Emperor's name, we echoed, our voices hollow. After he left, I found myself sitting next to the boy I'd noticed on the first day. Up close, I could see the marks of a mid-hive upbringing. Decent clothes, though worn now. Hands that had never done hard labor. A face that had known regular meals. He was staring at his hands, turning them over and over as if they belonged to someone else. "I'm Kael," I said quietly. He looked up, and I saw that his eyes were amber, an unusual color. "Davin," he replied. "House Davin of the Merchant Quarter. Not that it matters anymore." "No, I suppose it doesn't." We sat in silence for a while. Then, so quietly I almost didn't hear it, he whispered, "My mother cried when they took me. Not because she'd miss me, because she was relieved. Relieved I was finally gone, that the curse was removed. Do you think they'll remember us? Any of us?" I didn't have an answer. I didn't think anyone did. The shuttles came on schedule. They loaded us in groups of 50, herding us like livestock up the ramps and into the stripped-down cargo holds. No seats, no viewports, just bare metal walls and atmosphere processors that filled the space with recycled air that tasted of oil and ozone. The engines screamed as we lifted off, and I felt my stomach drop as we climbed toward orbit, toward the Black Ship waiting above, toward a fate that I could no longer pretend was anything but inevitable. The flight took less than an hour. When the shuttle docked, when the ramp descended and we filed out into the Black Ship's receiving bay, I understood for the first time what true scale meant in the Imperium. The bay was vast, cathedrally vast. The ceiling soared somewhere far above, lost in shadows that the harsh industrial lumens couldn't penetrate. Gantries and loading platforms stretched in every direction, each one filled with more shuttles, more human cargo, more witches being processed and categorized and prepared for transport. I could see other groups being led away down different corridors, hundreds of souls disappearing into the ship's depths. And this was just one bay. The ship had dozens. Maybe hundreds. Standing at the base of our shuttle's ramp was a figure that made every psyker present take an involuntary step backward. She was tall, taller than any woman I'd ever seen, wearing armor of silver and black. Her face was beautiful in a way that was almost offensive, too perfect, too symmetric, unmarred by any sign of human warmth. But it was her presence that struck us like a physical blow. Where she stood, the psychic background noise, the constant thrumming of other minds that I'd lived with for weeks, simply vanished. It was like stepping from a crowded room into a vacuum. Not peaceful, not quiet, just absent, empty, wrong. A sister of silence. A blank. A human being born with the pariah gene, whose very existence negated the warp. She didn't speak. Couldn't speak, I realized, noting the cables and augmetics at her throat. Instead, she gestured with sharp, precise hand movements, and the Astra Militarum troopers flanking her began barking orders. "Form lines, single file, no talking, keep moving." We moved. What else could we do? The corridors of the Black Ship were labyrinthine and oppressive. Everywhere, the walls were covered in ward symbols and prayers etched directly into the metal, layers upon layers of psychic protection built up over centuries. Gargoyles leered from corners, their faces frozen in expressions of anguish. Servo skulls drifted past on anti-grav units, their empty eye sockets glowing red with recording equipment. The air tasted of incense and metal, and something else. Something I couldn't quite identify, but that made my skin crawl. We descended. Down through deck after deck, past armories and chapels and chambers whose purposes I couldn't even guess at, always down, always deeper into the ship's core. The temperature dropped. The walls grew damp with condensation. The oppressive psychic weight that the Sister of Silence's presence had temporarily lifted began to return, growing stronger with each level we passed, until it felt like trying to breathe underwater. Finally, we reached the holds. The adept had called them cavernous, psi-shielded holds, and the description was entirely inadequate. The chamber they led us into was enormous, a vast darkness barely illuminated by lumens set at wide intervals along the walls. The ceiling was somewhere high above, invisible in the shadows. The floor was bare metal, cold enough to draw heat from your body even through your shoes. And already, even in the dim light, I could see that we weren't the first cargo to be loaded. Thousands. There had to be thousands of souls already packed into this space, sitting or lying on the floor in rough groups, their faces lit by the weak lumens in shades of gray and shadow. The psychic weight was crushing, a pressure against my mind that made my eyes water and my head throb with pain. Even with the dampener, even with the psi-shielded walls, the sheer density of terrified psychic minds in this space created a miasma of despair, so thick it was almost tangible. An adept, different from the one who'd addressed us in the sanctum, but wearing the same midnight blue robes, stepped forward. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow with exhaustion that spoke of decades spent in this duty. When he spoke, his voice echoed in the vast space. "Welcome to the Penitent Flame," he said. That was the ship's name, I realized. The Penitent Flame. "You will be housed in this hold for the duration of the journey. The ship will visit 14 worlds to collect the Emperor's tithe before proceeding to Holy Terra. This journey will take approximately 8 months. You will be fed twice daily. Sanitation facilities are located at the far end of the chamber. You will be administered torpor twice daily to prevent psychic incidents. You will not attempt to use your powers. You will not attempt to remove your dampeners. You will not attempt escape. Any violation of these rules will result in immediate execution. Any questions will be ignored. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects, we mumbled back. Find a space, sit down, make peace with your fate. And that was it. That was the entirety of our orientation. We were left to disperse into the darkness, to find whatever patch of cold metal floor we could claim, to join the thousands of other damned souls waiting in the belly of this ancient, terrible ship. I found a spot near what I guessed was the middle of the hold, far enough from the walls that I wouldn't freeze, but not so far that I couldn't navigate to the sanitation facilities in the dark. Davin followed me, and together we sat, backs against each other for warmth, and waited for whatever came next. The torpor came at what they said was evening, though day and night had no meaning in this lightless space. Servitors moved through the hold with pneumatic injectors, methodically working their way through the crowd, administering the drug to each witch in turn. When they reached me, I barely had time to feel the cold kiss of the injector against my neck before the world began to blur. The adept had described it as creating a grey, anxiety-ridden haze, and that was accurate in the way that describing a hurricane as windy is accurate. The torpor didn't put you to sleep. It didn't make you unconscious. It simply wrapped your mind in layers of cotton and fog, muffling your thoughts, dampening your emotions, making it almost impossible to focus on anything for more than a few seconds. And beneath the fog, there was a constant undercurrent of wrongness, of anxiety without source or solution, a nameless dread that ate at the edges of your consciousness like acid. I tried to hold on to myself, tried to remember my name, my home, my purpose, but the memories slipped away like water through my fingers. I knew I'd had a mother, a father. I knew I'd lived somewhere before this, but the details were lost in the grey haze, and after a while, I stopped trying to remember. It was easier that way, easier to just exist in the moment, in the cold and the darkness, and the oppressive weight of thousands of other minds, all lost in their own grey hazes. Time ceased to have meaning. They fed us twice daily, or so they claimed. I had no way to verify it. The servitors would arrive with crates of NutriPaste, the kind of processed food designed to keep you alive, without any consideration for taste or dignity. We would eat. The servitors would leave. We would sit in the darkness. They would return with more torpor. We would sleep, or something like sleep. And then it would all happen again. Days passed, weeks, I lost count. Beside me, Davin sometimes spoke. Fragments of sentences, half-formed thoughts that emerged from the torpor haze like bubbles rising from deep water. I might respond. I might not. It was hard to tell. Everything was hard to tell in the grey. But slowly, gradually, I began to adapt. The human mind is resilient in ways that are both blessing and curse. Even under the torpor, even in the constant psychic pressure of the holds, I found myself developing a kind of resistance. The fog never lifted, but I learned to navigate it. I learned to hold thoughts for minutes at a time rather than seconds. I learned to recognize the patterns of feeding and drugging, to mark the passage of time by the rhythm of the servitor's arrival. And I learned to feel the ship. We were moving, always moving. Through the warp, that nightmare realm that existed between stars where distance was meaningless and reality was merely a suggestion. I could feel it sometimes, in moments when the torpor thinned slightly, when my psychic senses brushed against the edges of the psi shields. The warp was screaming. That's the only word that comes close. A vast, eternal scream of hunger and madness and desire, held at bay by the ship's Geller fields and ancient wards. And in that scream, things moved, things noticed us, things pressed against the shields, testing for weaknesses, hungering for the feast of psychic souls packed so conveniently into this ship. Delicious little lights, bright little souls, let us in, let us taste. I learned not to listen. We all did, or we went mad. The madness took many. I watched it happen, helpless, as people I'd been sitting near for weeks suddenly snapped. Sometimes it was dramatic, screaming, clawing at their own faces, trying to tear off their dampeners to unleash their powers in one final blaze of defiance. Sometimes it was quiet. A person would simply stop responding, stop eating, stop moving, until the servitors came to drag away another corpse. The deaths were worse. Not the madness-induced ones, but the simple failures of the human body under stress. We were packed in cold, in darkness, in filth. Disease spread easily. Malnutrition was common despite the NutriPaste. People grew sick, and in the holds, there was no medical attention beyond the most basic stabilization. If you couldn't recover on your own, you died. Simple as that. I saw a woman. She'd been 3 spaces to my left, develop some kind of respiratory infection. I watched over the course of weeks as her breathing grew more labored, as her coughs became wet and rattling, as she slowly drowned in her own lungs. She died on what I calculated was day 63. The servitors dragged her body away. By the next feeding cycle, someone else had claimed her space. It should have horrified me more. It should have broken something in me to watch people die and feel nothing but a vague sense of relief that it wasn't me. But the torpor dulled everything, even horror. And beneath the torpor, a darker truth was emerging. I was starting to understand. This was necessary. One unsanctioned Psyker losing control could kill thousands. Could open a warp rift that would swallow an entire city. Could let demons pour through reality's skin and turn a world into a screaming hell. I'd heard the stories, and I knew they weren't propaganda. The warp was real. The danger was real, and we, all of us in these holds, were potential catastrophes waiting to happen. The Imperium couldn't afford to be gentle, couldn't afford to be kind. It could only afford to be thorough, efficient, and utterly without mercy. And in a strange way, this, the darkness, the cold, the torpor, the deaths, this was mercy. Because we were still alive, still had a chance, however slim, to prove ourselves worthy of service, still had a chance to matter, to mean something beyond our deaths. On what I calculated was day 97, the ship stopped. I felt it somehow through the haze, a change in the vibrations of the deck plates, a shift in the psychic background noise, a sense of transition. The servitors came with torpor as usual, but this time they also brought an announcement: we were entering normal space to collect more tithe from another world. The holds would be receiving additional cargo. Over the next week, thousands more witches were loaded into our hold. The vast space, which had seemed almost too large when we'd first arrived, became progressively more cramped as shuttle after shuttle deposited its human cargo. The psychic weight intensified, pressing down like a physical mass. The air grew thick with the smell of too many bodies in too small a space. The temperature rose slightly from so many living beings packed together. A small mercy against the cold, but a curse in every other way. And through it all, I watched. I observed. I learned. The new arrivals always went through the same progression. First came the fear, raw animal terror when they first saw the holds, first felt the crushing psychic presence. Then came the anger, rage at their fate, at the Imperium, at the Emperor himself for demanding this sacrifice. Then came the denial. Surely there's been a mistake. Surely they would be recognized as special, as different, as worthy of exemption. And finally, inevitably, came the acceptance. The slow death of hope. The settling into grey resignation. I watched Davin go through it. He'd been with me since the beginning, had somehow maintained his grip on sanity through the worst of the torpor, had become something like a friend in the way that people who share suffering become friends. But as we passed the 4-month mark, I saw the light fade from his amber eyes, saw him stop speaking except in monosyllables, saw him begin to stare at nothing for hours at a time. "Davin," I said one day, shaking his shoulder, "stay with me." He looked at me, and for just a moment, I saw the person he'd been. The merchant son from the mid-hive, the boy with prospects and family and a future. "Why?" he asked, and I had no answer. The ship collected tithe from 4 more worlds, 14 worlds total, as promised, visited over the course of 8 months. By the time we made the final transition, heading toward Holy Terra and the Scholastica Psykana, and whatever final judgment awaited us there were perhaps 25,000 souls packed into the holds, maybe more. I'd lost the ability to estimate accurately. Of the 50 who'd been on my shuttle from Hive Tertius, I could account for maybe 30. The rest were dead, mad, or simply lost somewhere in the vast crowd. Of those 30, only a handful had maintained any semblance of their original personality. The rest were hollow, broken things, kept alive by the torpor and the twice-daily feeding, but no longer truly human in any meaningful sense. Davin was one of them. He still sat beside me, still ate when the servitors came, still shuffled to the sanitation facilities when necessary. But he didn't speak anymore, didn't react. His eyes were open but empty, staring at something I couldn't see. I'd survived. Somehow, impossibly, I'd adapted to the holds. My mind had built walls against the psychic pressure, had learned to function despite the torpor, had found a strange kind of equilibrium in the horror. I didn't know if that made me strong or simply broken in a different way. On day 237, an adept came to the holds. He stood on a raised platform near the main entrance, surrounded by armed guards and servo skulls, and announced that we were approaching Terra, that within 2 weeks we would arrive at the Scholastica Psykana, that we should prepare ourselves for testing. "You have survived the journey," he said, his voice echoing through the vast space. "Many have not. This alone proves a strength of mind that the Imperium values. But survival is not enough. You must prove yourselves worthy of training, worthy of the Emperor's investment in your salvation. The testing will be rigorous. Many of you will be found wanting, but do not despair. Even in failure you serve. The Emperor requires sustenance, and your souls will feed the light that guides humanity through the darkness. There is no higher honor. There is no greater purpose." A murmur ran through the crowd. After 8 months of torpor and darkness, after so many deaths and so much suffering, we were finally approaching the end of the journey. But what waited at that end? Service or sacrifice? Salvation or consumption? I looked at Davin, hoping to see some reaction, some spark of the person he'd been, but his eyes remained empty, staring at nothing. He won't pass the testing, I realized. He's already gone, and I have to accept that. The ship entered the Sol system on day 249. They reduced the torpor dosage that day, the first time they'd done so since we'd boarded. The fog began to lift, slowly, painfully, like tearing adhesive from a wound. Sensation returned in waves. The cold of the metal floor became sharp and biting. The smell of the holds became overwhelming. The psychic weight of 25,000 minds pressed together became almost unbearable. But with the sensation came clarity, thought, memory. I remembered my name was Kael. I remembered I was from Hive Tertius. I remembered my parents, my home, the life I'd lost. And I remembered hope. Not the naive hope of my first days in the sanctum, but a harder, colder hope. The hope of someone who's survived hell and is determined not to let that suffering be meaningless. Around me, others were experiencing the same return to consciousness. Some wept, some prayed, some simply sat in stunned silence processing what they'd endured, and some, like Davin, didn't respond at all. The torpor had kept them alive, but it hadn't preserved them. They were gone, and no reduction in dosage could bring them back. On day 251, they brought us to the viewports. In groups of 100, they herded us up from the holds, through the corridors, to observation decks where we could see what awaited us. I went with the 4th group, and when I finally stood before the armored viewports and looked out at what they were showing us, I forgot to breathe. Terra, holy Terra, the throne world, cradle of humanity. I'd seen images, of course. Every child in the Imperium learns about Terra, sees the artistic renderings of the Emperor's palace and the hive cities that cover the world's surface. But no image, no description, could possibly capture the reality. The planet was beautiful and terrible all at once. From orbit, you could see the lights of billions upon billions of human souls, a corona of illumination that wrapped the world in a glow visible from space. You could see the massive orbital platforms and defense stations, the constant traffic of ships arriving and departing, the sheer impossible scale of humanity's heart. And dominating it all, visible even from this distance, was the palace. A mountain of gold and stone and steel that dwarfed anything I'd ever imagined, spreading across entire continents, reaching toward the heavens with spires that pierced the clouds. Somewhere in that vast structure, the Emperor sat on the golden throne. Undying, eternal, watching over humanity in his 10,000-year vigil. And somewhere in that structure, he hungered, feeding on 1,000 souls each day to maintain the Astronomican, the great psychic beacon that made faster-than-light travel possible. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said a voice beside me. I turned to find an adept standing there, not one I recognized, an older man with a face lined by decades of service. His eyes were sad but kind, the eyes of someone who'd seen everything and somehow maintained his humanity. "It is," I admitted. 23,000 souls this journey," he said quietly, looking out at Terra. 14 worlds visited, 87 lost to madness, possession or despair during the journey, 432 dead from disease or malnutrition. By the time we complete processing, perhaps 18,000 will remain, and of those, the Emperor will claim his due. I looked at him sharply. "You're telling me this why?" "Because you're one of the survivors," he said. "One of the ones whose mind remained intact. That's rare. That matters. And I wanted you to understand what you've endured, what you've survived. This journey isn't punishment, though I know it feels like it. It's filtration, winnowing. By the time you reach the Scholastica Psykana, you'll have proven that your mind is strong enough to endure what comes next." "And what comes next?" "Testing, evaluation, sorting." He turned to look at me directly. "You think this cruel? I have seen worlds burn because one witch went unsanctioned. I have witnessed demons pour through tears in reality because a child manifested in fear. The Emperor's mercy is not gentle, child, but it is mercy nonetheless. You live, for now. And after the testing, that depends on what they find. The strongest become Sanctioned Psykers, Astropaths, Battle Psykers, Inquisitorial Acolytes. Those with moderate ability join the Astronomican Choir, burn themselves out maintaining the beacon, and those who are too weak, too unstable, too dangerous." He trailed off. "Fed to the Emperor," I finished. "Consecrated to the Emperor," he corrected. "Their souls fuel the light that keeps humanity from extinction. There is no higher honor, no greater purpose, and it's necessary. All of it. Every death, every sacrifice, every soul consumed. Because the alternative is humanity lost in darkness, prey to the things that lurk in the warp." He started to turn away, then paused. "You'll do well in the testing, I think. You have the strength. The question is, do you have the stability?" "What's your name?" I asked. "Adept Cortus. I've served aboard the Black Ships for 43 years. I'll probably die aboard one, and I count myself blessed for the opportunity to serve." "How can you believe that, after everything you've seen?" "Because I've also seen the alternative. I was there at Hive Scorpios when a single, unsanctioned Psyker tore a hole in reality. I watched as demons poured through, as an entire Hive city of 15 million souls was consumed in a single night of horror. I saw things that I will never be able to unsee, that haunt my dreams every single night. And I understood, truly understood, why we do what we do." He met my eyes. "Faith without sacrifice is mere words. The Imperium demands blood, sweat, tears, and souls. These Psykers are humanity's tithe to the throne, and I do not grieve them. I envy them. They know their purpose with certainty. Most of us die wondering if we mattered." He left me standing at the viewport, staring out at Terra, processing his words. Do I believe him? I wondered. Do I accept this system, this endless grinding machine that consumes souls to fuel its survival? I thought about my mother's relief when they took me away. Thought about the woman who drowned in her own lungs beside me in the holds. thought about Davon's empty eyes, thought about the 18,000 of us who would reach the Scholastica Psykana, and the 1,000 who would die each day to feed the Emperor. And I thought about the alternative. Chaos, possession, worlds burning, reality itself tearing open to unleash horrors beyond human comprehension. I didn't know if I believed, but I understood. And maybe, in the Imperium, that was enough. The transfer to the Scholastica Psykana took 3 days. They brought us down in waves, shuttle after shuttle descending through Terra's atmosphere to the massive fortress complex that housed the Imperium's psychic training facilities. From the air, I could see that the Scholastica was built like a prison, which in essence it was. Walls hundreds of feet high, guard towers bristling with weapons, sealed gates that looked capable of withstanding an orbital bombardment. This was where they brought Psykers to be broken and remade, to be tested and sorted, to be judged worthy or wanting. They processed us again. More data slates, more records, more classification. They removed our dampeners, finally blessedly removed them, and the sudden absence of that constant pressure was like surfacing from deep water. For the first time in 8 months, I could breathe without feeling like I was suffocating. But they didn't leave us unrestrained for long. Within hours, we were fitted with new dampeners, different ones, more sophisticated, designed not to completely suppress our powers, but to limit them, to make them controllable. These felt different, less oppressive but more invasive, like having your thoughts constantly monitored. They separated us into groups based on preliminary assessments. I lost track of Davon in the shuffle, caught one last glimpse of him being led away with the lowest classification group, the ones who'd be tested first and judged harshest. I tried to feel something, grief, fear, anger, but after 8 months in the holds, my emotions felt distant and muted. He'd been my companion in suffering, but I couldn't save him. I could only try to save myself. The testing began on the 4th day. They brought me into a chamber lined with psychic shielding and monitoring equipment. A panel of 3 Inquisitors sat behind a reinforced table, their faces hidden by hoods, their voices modulated by Vox units. Servo skulls circled overhead, recording everything. And standing to one side, silent and terrifying, was a Sister of Silence. Psyker Kael of Hive Tertius, one of the Inquisitors said. You have survived the journey aboard the Penitent Flame. You have demonstrated a strength of mind that is rare and valuable. Now you will demonstrate your control, your stability, and your utility to the Imperium. They pushed me, hard, harder than I'd ever been pushed before. They made me demonstrate my abilities, the telepathy, the empathy, the premonition. They tested my resistance to psychic attack by having a Sanctioned Psyker assault my mind with waves of fear and pain. They exposed me to warp energy in controlled bursts, measuring how I responded, watching for any sign of instability or possession risk. They questioned me about my beliefs, my loyalties, my willingness to serve. Hours passed. The testing went on and on, each exercise more demanding than the last, each question more probing. I could feel them measuring me, weighing me, determining my worth like a merchant evaluating merchandise. And through it all I held on. I drew on the strength I'd built in the holds, the walls I'd constructed in my mind to survive the psychic pressure in the torpor. I showed them control, I showed them stability. I showed them that I could be useful, could be valuable, could be worth the Imperium's investment in training me rather than consuming me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they stopped. Psyker Kael, the Central Inquisitor said. You are classified as Tau grade, sufficient strength for astropathic training or battle psyker service, sufficient stability for soul binding. You will proceed to advanced training. You will serve the Imperium as a Sanctioned Psyker. Do you accept this duty? I'm going to live, I thought, and the realization hit me like a physical blow. I'm going to survive. I'm going to matter. I accept, I said, in the Emperor's name. In the Emperor's name, they echoed. They led me out through a different door than I'd entered, down corridors lined with the same oppressive wards and symbols that had covered the Black Ship. But these felt different somehow, not like a prison, but like a sanctuary. A place where I would be shaped, trained, transformed into something that could serve. As we walked, I passed a viewport that looked out over one of the Scholastica's courtyards. Below, I could see another group of Psykers being led in chains toward a different building, a squat, fortress-like structure with no windows, surrounded by even more guards than usual. The sacrifice group, the ones found wanting, the ones who would feed the Emperor. I counted them automatically. About 1,000. A single day's tithe, just as Adept Quartus had said. 1,000 souls who'd survived their worlds, survived the collection, survived the journey, only to be consumed at the end. And I felt nothing. Not relief that I'd been spared, not guilt that they hadn't. Just a numb acceptance of the reality. This was the Imperium. This was necessary. Individual lives didn't matter. Only survival mattered. Only service mattered. There are thousands of us in this darkness, I thought, remembering the holds. And I can feel them all. Their fear tastes like acid. Their despair weighs like lead. We are cargo. We are currency. We are fuel for a dying god. And some small part of me, Emperor, helped me understands why. That was 37 years ago. I serve now as an astropath, my soul bound to the Emperor, my eyes burned blind by the psychic fire of that binding. I send messages across the void, my thoughts carried on the warp to distant worlds, enabling the Imperium to function across impossible distances. I am useful, I am valuable, I matter, but I still dream of the holds. I dream of the darkness and the cold and the crushing weight of thousands of terrified minds pressed together in that vast space. I dream of Davin's empty eyes. I dream of the woman who drowned in her lungs. I dream of the 1,000 souls per day being fed to the Golden Throne, their bodies and souls consumed to maintain the Astronomican, the great beacon that makes my work possible. And I wonder, in my darker moments, if I was right to survive. If being spared was truly mercy or just a different kind of damnation. The Black Ships still sail. The League of Blackships is still the second largest fleet in the galaxy, thousands of vessels carrying out their grim duty across 1 million worlds. Every century they come. Every century they collect the tithe. Every century, tens of thousands of souls board those dark ships and make the journey to Terra. And since the Great Rift tore the galaxy in half, since the barriers between reality and warp weakened, the number of Psykers being born has increased exponentially. More witches, more tithe, more souls needed to feed the Emperor, to maintain the Astronomican, to keep humanity's light burning in the darkness. The system will continue. Must continue, because the alternative is unthinkable. But I remember Adept Quartus's question, do you have the stability? And I realize now that the question wasn't about psychic control. It was about something deeper. It was about whether I could live with the knowledge of what the Imperium truly is, what it truly demands, and still serve without breaking. 37 years later, I still don't know the answer. I know the Black Ships are necessary. I know the sacrifice is necessary. I know that without the Emperor's tithe, without the 1,000 souls per day feeding the throne, humanity would fall into darkness and extinction. I know all this with absolute certainty, but I also know what it costs. I know what it feels like to be cargo. I know what 8 months in the holds does to a human soul. I know that the Imperium's mercy is measured in degrees of suffering, and that sometimes the ones who die quickly are the lucky ones. And I know that the Black Ships are worse than death. Not because death is preferable, though sometimes in the holds it seems so, but because they strip everything from you before the end. Your dignity, your hope, your humanity. They reduce you to a number, a classification, a piece of data to be sorted and processed, and either utilized or consumed. Death is an ending. The Black Ships are a journey through hell that might or might not end in death, and the uncertainty is part of the torture. You spend months knowing that you might be chosen to serve, that you might survive, that you might matter, and that hope, that small, poisonous hope, makes every moment of suffering sharper, every loss more painful, every degradation more complete. If they simply killed all Psykers on sight, it would be a mercy. But the Imperium cannot afford mercy. It can only afford survival. And so the Black Ships sail on, collecting their tithe, delivering their cargo, feeding the Emperor's endless hunger, and will continue to sail for as long as the Imperium endures, for as long as humanity clings to existence in a hostile galaxy. I serve, I endure, and I remember. The Emperor protects, but he protects through sacrifice. And sometimes I think he protects us from nothing so much as the knowledge of what we've become. In the darkness between the stars, the Black Ships are loading their next cargo. Another 100 worlds, another 100,000 souls, another journey through hell that will winnow the survivors down to those strong enough, stable enough, useful enough to matter. And they will ask themselves the same question I asked myself in the holds, in the testing chambers, in the 37 years since. Was I right to hope, to despair, to serve, to die? There is no good answer. There is only the Imperium, vast and terrible and necessary. There is only the Emperor's will, demanding sacrifice upon sacrifice upon sacrifice. There is only survival, purchased at a cost that compounds with every passing century. And there are only the Black Ships, worse than death, sailing on through the darkness, forever.